Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this lecture this evening and the following dictation of beloved Saint Germain, le Comte du Saint-Germain, who will speak sometime between 8 and 9 o'clock, presumably. Our lecture tonight will deal with the subject of vibrations. They always manage to muster a dying gasp of a little opposition whenever I start, as a rule. One of the interesting ones in Washington, D.C. was when the motorcycle patrolman pulled up just as the dictation started, and all of the local Washington, D.C. police calls were coming over his loudspeaker on the motorcycle. And lo and behold, it developed that he was there to ticket me. And the worst of it was that I wasn't guilty of anything because I'd only parked in a hotel zone long enough to actually unload. And then somebody put a ticket on my car, and within the 3 minutes or 4 minutes I'd been there before. And so he had come to collect it. Rather interesting. Getting back to the subject of vibrations, which we just started when we had that little blast there, vibrations, in our opinion, are particularly interesting because they are emitted by all people. We all have a vibration. But this vibration of necessity must be a composite one. And yet those who have great discernment are able to separate the various layers of the vibratory actions of the human mind and the feelings of man. The causes of vibrations are, of course, our thoughts and our feelings. And the more acute, the more deeply we feel, or the more deeply we think, the greater release of the vibrational level. Now, almost all of you have had an experience, I'm sure, at one time or another, where you picked up someone's vibration because the vibration was so violent that you couldn't mistake the intent. These vibrations can be read by almost anyone, but the more subtle form of vibrations are more difficult to read. Vibrations of thought and hypocrisy, for example, which is quite apparent in the world today. There's a great deal of dishonesty and hypocrisy in the world. And I suppose some people presume that it's quite comfortable to be able to read vibrations to the effect that they can detect all of these problems that people are actually creating by the wrong thought and wrong feeling. But I have found over the years, to be quite frank with you, that it is perhaps best sometimes to hold the immaculate concept rather than actually try to amplify, say, a negative vibration that someone may be throwing out. Because in reality, as the masters have said, if we knew better, we would do better. And this includes holding the immaculate concept about everyone. Doesn't everyone change from time to time? The drunkard of today may be the saint of tomorrow. Who knows? It's a little difficult when we see him going along, hiccuping down the street and landing in the gutter, for us to imagine that the gentleman or lady may be a saint in a number of years hence. And a very interesting story is told of Lord Buddha and how a lady of ill reputation came to him. And she formed quite an attachment for Lord Buddha. It seemed to be almost an infatuation. And everywhere that Buddha went, this prostitute went also. And this, of course, became a source of irritation to some of his precise followers, who couldn't quite understand why he would give her the time of day. Well, several years, I guess, passed during which this devotee of a questionable nature pursued the Buddha. And finally, one day, in the heart of his meditations, he turned to the group and he said, "My beloved calls me." And they didn't know what he meant at first, and finally he said that I must go to her. And it was this questionable lady. And he got up, and he traveled along the road to where she was, and here she was afflicted with the smallpox. So he promptly turned around and healed her. But his disciples were in a great dither, lest he would in some way contaminate himself. But actually, he was able to sense beneath the surface and perceive that the devotion was a genuine devotion for his soul and his teachings. And so he had the same sense as was manifested by Christ in his various associations that caused Christ to be labeled a wine-bibber and a friend of prostitutes and sinners. I think it's quite interesting that those who are trained to see beneath the surface, the mere surface stirring of vibrations, realize that whereas the surface of the sea may be turbulent with violent emotions of various types, and the mind may be agitated, yet in the depth of the sea there is peace and quiet. And therefore I believe that whereas it is interesting and phenomenal to be able to read and detect vibrations, as I have actually moved along the pathway of life, I have come to realize that this which appeared to be so phenomenal to me at first, today holds less and less glamour for me. Basically, the only interest I have in vibrations is probably in protecting my friends or my associates or the activity or some of God's beloved endeavors upon earth from the slanderous things that people sometimes say based on ignorance. And so I find that rather than be interested just in the ability to detect psychically what is going on in someone else, I seek rather to see if there is an entrance in their consciousness where they really want to be lifted up, to find greater attunement with their own divine self, greater awareness with who and what they are. This is far more important because the personality is often a chimera. You look at the surface and you say, this is the way they are. This is why I don't like her. This is why I don't like him. It's because this is the way they are. People, dear hearts, are not actually evil in most cases. Evil is a manifestation of misunderstanding. People become overly defensive because of the fact that the world is sometimes cruel to them. But many times they do not recognize that their defensiveness is the result of a karma of their own making somewhere along the line. Most of you remember the classic example of the woman at the well and how Christ alerted her by telling her what she was doing, but swiftly entered into a spirit of teaching. Because after all, our basic raison d'etre, our reason for living, should certainly be one of assistance to our fellow men rather than our rejection of them. It is quite interesting how people often enter into a tug of war mentally with anybody that they meet just on the basis of asserting their own ego. I had a very interesting experience several years ago, and it's a little funny, so I think you might enjoy hearing it. I was giving an address in Washington, D.C., and a young lady from Chicago had decided she would come to that conference to hear me speak, but she had not seen my picture. She didn't know what I looked like. So I was walking down the hotel hall right behind her, heading for the lecture room. she went in, and as I reached for the doorknob, she quickly closed the door in my face. Well, I wasn't offended, so I just reached out to grab it, and she held it and wouldn't let the knob turn. So I kept on tugging, and the tug of war lasted until she outlasted her own strength, and finally I thrust it open with quite a thrust, and she then timidly dashed off to a seat. However, even now she didn't know I was a speaker. And so she looked for me to sit down somewhere in the audience, and lo and behold, I walked up to the platform. And she was quite embarrassed when all this happened. But it was rather interesting in a way, because people sometimes flee when no man pursueth. Getting then back to another phase of the subject of vibrations, I started out to say that all things emit their vibrations. From a scientific and technical standpoint, we can say that in the fourth dimensional sense, everything probably has its own vibratory action. And what is the purpose of vibration? Save to manifest a certain specific quality. So when we are able to identify an object by its vibrations, as sometimes the blind learn to do, we are able then simply to recognize what it is that is there. If it's a piece of wood, a piece of paper, a sponge, a glass bottle, a television set, or a person, we identify animate and inanimate objects by our vibratory senses. It is an absolute truth that when these senses are opened, when our spiritual eye, the eye that vibrates in the center of the forehead, is open, and we possess singleness of vision, which all do, but all have not activated, we are able to gaze at objects and identify them very, very rapidly. This identification can be helpful to man, because I believe that once you become proficient in the use of the third eye, it will serve you better than the two eyes that otherwise serve you. Because the third eye usually, especially in a trained person who has spiritual honesty, will give you an accurate report of what you are contacting. It is literally impossible to fool the third eye in a very highly developed spiritual sensitive. And I don't say this from a standpoint of conceit, for the best of mankind in any field can err. Mistakes can be made by anyone. But that's not the point. It's a matter of the percentages of accuracy. In most cases, not in the exception that probably proves the rule, but in most cases, an active third eye sees clearly. As Jesus said, if thine eye be single, thy whole body shall be full of light. If, however, we have the tree of good and evil sense, that as we look at people, we see people as good and evil, we tend, as I pointed out in the story of Mr. Wright this afternoon, we tend to, in most cases, gravitate or fall into the error of classifying people by their negatives, rather than recognizing the enormous potential for good that is in everyone. One interesting thing about evil in the eye of God, which doesn't exist, because he has said, mine eyes are too pure to behold iniquity. One interesting fact is this, that whatever the Spirit of God sees is produced in a greater sense. If God then gazed at human imperfection, he would amplify it, which is the reason why God does not see evil. We, in a lesser way, being co-creators with God, in the error of our ways, whenever we gaze at anyone, to amplify the evil aspects of that person, to fall into the gravitational slot of wrongly classifying people simply because the surface of the person has some error in it, is wrong. It's completely wrong. And how would we like it done to us? How would we like it if someone that had a great deal of spiritual power would use that power to amplify negative qualities in our life? I'm convinced that in some cases, mother-in-laws do just that to their young daughter-in-laws without probably even realizing what they're doing. In fact, young people sometimes feel that they're walking on eggs, and so a defensive position is created in their consciousness. Who among us would not develop some degree of inferiority feelings if every move we made was either criticized in an open manner, where they would actually tell us about it, or if whatever we done was criticized in a subtle manner, where it was either told to someone else as a form of gossip, or it was just held in mind as a power to amplify evil? We wouldn't like it, and it would tend to give us a feeling of inferiority, and that feeling of inferiority would not bring out the best in us, but the worst. And how dire this is depends upon whether or not we let it affect us. As I indicated this afternoon, wise is the man or woman who learns to throw off the patine or the layer of human sewage, and that is exactly what it is, that they throw over us like a pail of slop. I don't like the word, but are there any pretty names for ugly tricks? Yet people do this in many cases thoughtlessly. They do not realize that the law of karma will bring back to them whatever they send out. How wise then are we each time, whether we understand that law or not, that we send out an activity of love in preference to doing evil? Because evil has a very interesting way of coming back to us when we least expect it. Sometimes when we're riding the glory wave of human accomplishments, we suddenly find that the bill collector, the cosmic bill collector, is right there. And it doesn't really help us when we're riding high. So I think that above all things, the great obligation, not only of the Christian church, but of every church in the world, should be to alert people to the great law of karma. I think it was the late Edgar Casey of the Association for Research and Enlightenment of Virginia Beach who pointed out how in the past the church, and he was a very faithful church member, how the church had distorted the teachings of Christ. And he, of course, was one of the scholars who pointed out the existence of Theodora and Justinian and how they introduced warps into Christian doctrine, which warps actually are still effective in creating tremendous antagonisms between many of the faiths over the various cardinal points, as they put it, of Christian doctrine. I am hopeful now then that with the current release of Mary, the Mother of Jesus, which she is now bringing forth in the Pearls of Wisdom as part of the current series, which are calculated to awaken mankind to the growth of this evil and the perpetuation of this in the church, may serve to eliminate some of these problems from our both social and religious structures. Actually, the churches that have been founded throughout the world in our time and dating back to Christ and even before were formed in order to minister and administer to man, to help man develop a greater awareness of God. Many of the magnificent systems of the religions of the world have been developed for thousands of years, and when truth prevails in their presentations, they can only benefit the soul of every person that participates in them. You cannot in any way become involved in these rituals, in these teachings, and I'm not speaking just of our teachings, but of the great white brotherhood, of the masters of wisdom. For the masters of wisdom do not always speak profoundly. They speak according to the levels of mankind's needs, and they create various schools deliberately to provide a service of ministration to the people who are at various stages and levels of development. So when we deal with vibrations, we must understand that we are merely dealing with natural law. And natural law functions always. It is consistent because it is a part of God. Have you ever thought of God as law? A law sometimes seems cold, icy, frigid to mankind. He can't always have the same warmth in his feeling world or in his mind for law that he has for love. And yet law is love. It is the love of constancy. It is the love of dependability. It is God's love that enables us to function in a universe of consistency, where we actually do not have the elements of the universe warring with each other. What a terrible and frightful thing it would be if nature were to rebel against man. Yes. But I am sure that many of you know that this does happen, that thorns and thistles and difficult manifestations in nature exist because of mankind's tampering with the beauty and perfection that was the original part of the universal plan manifest in nature. I think then that we should stop right what we're doing now, our lecture, and stop long enough to consider how very, very thankful we ought to feel for the giant consistencies of nature. If nature were always temperamental, if nature were actually returning to man without mercy all that man has done, I doubt that the world could move or continue to move through space. I doubt that the fabric of our lives would hold together. For in ignorance as a race, mankind have actually engaged in enormous activities of complete ignorance of the perfection of God, of complete ignorance of the beauties of God that are inherent with the structure of themselves or with their mind, and certainly the great sin of omission involved in man's failure to use his great divine potential. I am most grateful that more and more the power of universal love is awakening many people to an understanding of just exactly how much good they can derive from the spiritual world. And I'm going to tell you something tonight in this lecture on vibrations. The theory has always been, let's go out into the world and let's bring everybody to the feet of God. It has been said, and rightly so, that the time would come that man would seek God and he would hide his face from them. I believe this, and I believe it may well happen to the world en masse. In fact, I have reason to believe that in effect, based upon the lives of individuals, that this has happened to the individual. I think perhaps the great teaching that was released by St. John of the Cross, who wrote of the dark night of the soul, we may be able to understand that those who have actually turned their back upon the realities of spirit for many, many years or even lifetimes cannot anticipate of necessity that easy return that the freeways promise us. You know, a sign appears, says exit for the Gulf station, an easy return at the next exit. When you're through, you can fill up with gas and get right back on the freeway. Well, I don't think that man without impunity can always completely ignore God and his plan without sometime finding a frigid universe. At least it will appear so. And I think that such chastisement is actually partly the result of God's determination to see to it that he draws from the great net of the world the elect, those who decide themselves that they are going to make their calling and election sure. Heaven has invested great storehouses of cosmic energy in mankind, and they have literally showered and poured out into the world this energy. I have seen it again and again. I have seen healings performed that are almost unbelievable, miracles of divine love and intervention, only to see people as soon as the great monster of the threat to their lives has disappeared, that now they will return, as it says in the Scriptures, the sow has returned to her wallowing in the mire, and the dog has returned to his own vomit again. This, to me, is really very, very unfortunate. It is unfortunate for the individual. I think the great monolith of the Spirit is like something far greater than a General Sherman tank. Did you ever see somebody pick up a Coke bottle and throw a Coke bottle at a General Sherman tank? It doesn't make a dent on it. The glass shatters, but the tank is unaffected. People who will shake their fist and curse God, as men do today, are making a grave error, because God is all love, all perfection, and all strength, and he exists as a potency within everyone. How foolish it is for us to deny the perfection of ourselves. And therefore I advocate in the name of the hierarchy that each individual man shall awaken, at least to some degree, to the potential of his life or her life. And the realization that this does not mean that God is of necessity concerned only with the glorification of the personality for the sake of name and fame, but for showering something far greater upon mankind than name or fame, divine recognition. Because he who will deny me before men, I will deny him before my Father, simply means that if we are so foolish as to deny our own divine potential, the universe will automatically deny us the great storehouse of divine sonship. It is a wonderful thing, the love of Jesus Christ. To love Jesus is wonderful, but we must draw nigh to him with something more than our lips. We must draw nigh to him with the intention of imbibing the great fountain of immortality and life that he has promised us. This is a tangible, real manifestation. It comes to those that wait for it, that wait upon God, that determine that they are going to be in the image of the woman and the unjust judge. You remember the story? Here was the judge coming out of the courthouse. She couldn't get to see him in his chambers, and she thought perhaps she could pull his garments on the street. So she got a hold of his garments and tried to pull on them, and he was a big judge. He just kept on walking. He wouldn't listen. So the next morning, when he came out of the chambers at the same hour, she was there. And the next morning, and ad infinitum, she went on. And so the judge turned to his friends and he said, "Lest this woman weary me, I will grant what she wants." We can take a great lesson from this and lay hold on the skirts of divinity. We can get a hold of the heavenly judge and be like this woman, and then gain what we want. And we see it again in the story of Jacob wrestling with the angel. Jacob wrestled with the angel till the dawn was about ready to break. And he strained his thigh in his wrestling. And finally, he said to the angel, he said, "Bless me." And the angel said, "No." And he says, "I won't let you go till you bless me." And so in order to secure his release, the angel blessed him. So we must recognize that there is a great story of hope, illumination, of light for mankind that he may actually engage in this type of cosmic action. I want to then bring in a point governing the ascended master consciousness. I have known Master El Morya for quite a while in this lifetime, and truly El Morya is a man for all seasons. He was, as some of you are aware of, Sir Thomas More, the man for all seasons, made known to us by the drama. Nevertheless, the character of this man was impeccable in the time of Henry VIII, and he lost his head for the high standards which he espoused. Yet as he stood ready to mount the scaffold, going up to see family and friends no more, to bid this world goodbye, he could jest with his headsman. Turned to him and he said, as he touched his beard, he said, "May I move my beard to one side, for I do not believe it has offended the king." And then he turned to him and said, "Do your job well, and do it quickly, for," he said, "you send me to God." What a marvelous spirit that this soul could jest in the face of death. "For I have the keys of hell and of death." That is what Christ said. And Christ did not say it only to the apostles, but to the men and women of every age. The stirring reality of the return of the Christ consciousness, coming out of the clouds of obscurity as he went into heaven from Bethany's hill. The fact that our inner eyes can behold him, for every eye shall see him. And what then also does it say? For when we shall see him as he is, we shall be like him. So, while we do not deny all possibilities and recognize full well that if Christ wishes to appear somewhere in the air on the landed surface of the earth, above the landed surface, and then wishes to circumnavigate the world, going all around the world like the sun or a spaceship upon a white cloud, certainly he has the capacity to summon and draw all men that he wishes to his throne, if that be his will. But then we have to recognize that one is taken and another is left, that two are grinding the mill and one is taken and another is left, that two are tilling the field, one is taken and another left. We have to recognize that there is nothing wrong in the reappearance of the Christ in our time and in a timeless way, so that the people of all ages, in their beholding of the great cosmic Christ and their witnessing to the beauty and perfection that he manifested, they, as they see through the power of illumined vision, will be capable of manifesting. For we shall see him as he is, and we shall be like him, because we see him as he is. And so straight seeing and straight knowledge coincide, and the Arhat is ever mindful of every element of his life. Many people today are troubled because their thoughts are not always pure. For example, I was amazed to find in the area where we come from that we had a person in the service who had a vision of me far worse than in my red flannel underwear, which I don't wear, and admitted it to me. Now, obviously, there is something wrong with a person thinking along those lines. You just don't do it. It just isn't being done because there is nothing to be gained by it. But the Master said, we cannot help it. He wasn't speaking of himself, but he meant people could not help it. If a bird landed on their head, he said, they do not need to let it build a nest in their hair. And that is the great truth of the Masters. To recognize that tramp thoughts, thoughts that flow from depraved minds, people who have allowed themselves to enter into psychic and what we call obsessional warps, may release their thoughts because they are a part of God. And these thoughts will actually manifest at certain levels of consciousness. But the release of those thoughts does not mean that we are going to get them on the hook of our mind, unless, perchance, certain negative forces directly turn them against us because we are coming to the light. Which brings us to a very important vibrational fact that I must alert you to. And that is that as long as you are going with the world, and this concept I want to clarify, the devil never bothers anyone he's sure of. And so as long as you're going with the world, as long as you're moving in the vibration of the mass consciousness, you probably will not be bothered. But if you start entering in to the Summit Lighthouse, if you start studying the teachings, if you start listening to dictations, if you start decreeing, if you start moving on the pathway back to God, I can promise you that you're probably going to be bugged. You're going to have, to some degree, a life of bitterness at first. And why? Because it is their hope that they can discourage you from the path, that they can eliminate you from the path, that they can make you say, well, I had a better life before I actually started in that work. I think I'll quit. I'll get out of it. I'll go elsewhere. I was more comfortable in my church before I joined this group because, you know, they're bothering me right now. I sometimes can't sleep. I'm woke up every once in a while at 4 o'clock in the morning, and different things happen to me that somehow or other I think I'll go back and just think about God and Christ, and I don't know, all these masters, they bother me. Well, you know, here's the situation. We have a room full of people here. Now, if one of you in this room was Jesus Christ himself, the question in my mind is, would you find anything wrong in your becoming like Jesus Christ? Why, of course you wouldn't. There's nothing wrong in that. But as soon as people start being good, what do their cronies sometimes say? Who do you think you are? You're a little Jesus? Or something? And they say it in that sort of way with a derogatory twist to it. I mean, they don't really want you to be good, and yet they themselves hunger and thirst after righteousness, and all of their activities in the world, everything they do is a search for righteousness, but they won't admit it because they don't understand it. They don't recognize it. They don't realize it. And what a pity it is. Yet, I don't want to shed a sympathetic tear because they are learning. And let's say, thank God, for even the chastisements of God. Because he has said that whom he loveth, he chastiseth, and scourgeth every son whom he receiveth. So what's the first thing the masters will probably do? They'll let you come face to face with that dweller on the threshold. You're going to meet this monster that you have created. And when have you created it? Why, all your life you've been busy creating it. And now that you're coming face to face with the divine image once again, returning to that beautiful purity that you had in the beginning with God, quite naturally you have to meet and defeat the dweller on the threshold. Why, this is the very monster that you have created by the occult means of not even realizing what occult means. Strange, isn't it? But that's the way it is. You create it, you did it, you have to clean it up. And there's nothing wrong with that idea at all. In fact, some of the great masters in their final novitiate, before they actually entered into the great vibratory action of full oneness with God, every time they see a circumstance coming to them that is really hurtful, why, they look at this circumstance and they say, come on, here I am. I'm ready to take you on. And so it is really interesting. It's just delightful that these things are happening to people, because that's the only way they're going to get purified. Sometime, somewhere, this is a requirement of the law. And the most interesting thing is people are like monkeys. They climb up the string, you know, trying to get rid of their karma, and they get up so high and they look down and they say, this is an awful way to fall. And then, when they're looking down from that position, they don't recognize that if they fall down, they're going to have to climb all the way up to where they were and then start going again. So it's really very silly to fall all the way down. Instead of that, keep on going. I don't say that sometimes, like a yo-yo, people won't drop a little in consciousness. Don't be affrighted in this. I remember the first time I flew in an airplane, or one of the first times, every time we hit an air pocket and we dropped, I'd think, oh, we're going down. We're going to hit the ground right now. This is the end. Goodbye, cruel world. But it just doesn't happen that way. I mean, as a rule, we have quite a seaworthy or airworthy craft, both in the air and the sea. When you cross the ocean in a ship and you go up on the waves, the same thing happens. You wonder if you're going to sink. Well, it takes an awful lot to sink a boat, and it takes quite a bit of stress to down a plane. Of course, a bullet can do it, but then I mean by normal means, an aeroplane will take an awful lot of buffeting before it actually goes down. So we must understand that these drops are actually part of the experience of moving on the path. But the drops occur, and as soon as you get down to a certain level, it's perfectly natural that you go up again. And I think that we should learn to be calm in the face of stress and strife. Because by welcoming the return of our karma, of course, one lady I knew back at headquarters there, I guess she's still there, but one day she prayed and she said, "Oh, masters of wisdom," she said, "please return all my karma from all past lives on me right now. I want to get it all over with." Well, they started. The call compels the answer. And the answer came forth, and before the day was at an end, she says, "Oh, please stop it." Because there is a certain element of mercy in the fact that it returns to us in small steps, in just a few teaspoonfuls at a time rather than shovelfuls, which might bury us. Because heaven is not interested in burying us or defeating us. Heaven merely wants to make it possible for us to bear whatever we have to bear and attain our victory. Now, this is quite an interesting thing. Did you ever hear of a bodhisattva? Well, a bodhisattva is someone who says they're going to keep coming back to this world until the last person on this world is free. They want to help. They want everybody free. And this is a spirit that probably, in a minor way, manifests in a very young man or woman when they have the state of Weltschmerz. You know what I'm talking about. Because you're German, right? Okay. It is a world pain, a feeling that comes to a very young person when they first face and see all of the violence and the destructivity, and this being compounded almost daily. They say, well, what is going to happen? It's quite natural. And then when you get older, do you lose it? Some people do and some don't. A certain amount of callousness sometimes occurs to people because either they age into bitterness or they mellow into an understanding that we're never going to get out of this world alive in a physical sense, and that death and taxes, as Franklin said, are almost inevitable. So we don't concern ourselves too much with these things because we understand that we have lived before, and we understand that we will live again, and that we will live forever in the Christ consciousness. Well, if this is true, and all evidences that we have ever seen have pointed to its absolute veracity. For example, I hate to tell you this. I don't like the word hate, so forgive me for saying it, but I don't like to tell you this. But many times we have a complete blackout from an automotive sense, that we'll start out in the morning, we'll come to the first stop sign, and there at the first stop sign we'd be ready to go, and there's a car right there on a very untraveled road, perhaps. And when this happens every day of your life, and if you get up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the post office and mail a letter you forgot, it happens then also. And if you stop somewhere to see someone, and before you can get out of your car, in this obscure road, you suddenly find 100 cars coming from all directions with headlights on high, and then a man comes behind you and he looks at your license plate, he goes into his driveway, drives around his garage, comes back onto the street, looks your car over again, then goes around twice, you might decide at that time that something is a little bit above the law of chance. You follow me? We have all kinds of things like this happen. Harassments that are absolutely unbelievable. And why? These harassments are entirely because of the opposition that is created by the negative forces opposing the extension of the knowledge that we have to convey as a mouthpiece for the hierarchy. Oh, they don't care how many cartoons you watch. They don't care how many little story scenarios you watch on TV. They don't care if you go to the ball game. They don't care what you do, as long as you keep your attention magnetized to something that is of the world, of the earth, earthy. But the moment a man begins to study the hidden side of life, the moment he desires to achieve or attain to his natural perfection, he will encounter opposition. So I'm going to tell you right now that the little book that's called Climb the Highest Mountain will be sweet in your mouth, but it will be bitter in your belly. Because to study truth and to know how to use its laws is very entertaining to the mind. We really fall in love with these things because it's like dreams of flying. Some people are taken up with dreams where they're always flying through the air with the greatest of ease, like the daring young man on the flying trapeze. You know what I mean? They absolutely have dreams of flying. And why? Because one time long ago, man had the power of levitation before he lost it. And so it was very easy for him to fly. And so we have to understand that the bitter pills will be delivered to us until they are no longer bitter. Oh, I don't mean that we're going to have a total blackout. I don't mean our life's going to be tortuous. We're going to be like we're in prison. We're already in prison. We have lost most of our spiritual freedom as human beings. The moment we took on ourselves the encasement of a solid body of substance, the moment we overcame the babyhood stage and the putting of oatmeal into our mouth and spilling it all over our bib, the moment we grew up, right away in the adult world, we've come face to face with a world of problems. Now, whether or not we can cope with these problems depends upon us more than it depends upon God. This is one of the problems that I want to bring to you right now, and one of the truths I want you to know. God has set everything up so you can win. He's given you every assistance like he gave Jesus Christ. Every master, every avatar has been given God's assistance. And the same power that created the failures of some people, even the fallen angels, can be used to create God's success. You are the one that has to decide, and believe it or not, it is your determination, your alliance with the will of God, that is the difference. That's what makes the difference, is your determination. I definitely believe and I definitely know from all of my training from the masters that the will in man is what is either strong or weak. And it is the will that we must intensify. And this is increasing our vibrational level of determination. If we don't have determination ourselves, we cannot expect that God will not have it. See, if we don't have it, that isn't going to make God not have it, because we don't have it. He's got it already. He always has had it. That's why he's God. That's why the spirit of perfection and action is in the universe. The Holy Spirit is a spirit of action. It is not a spirit that is sleeping. It's a spirit that's awake, and it's a spirit that's vital. And we all can drink into the same spirit. What a wonderful thing that we are not denied that except by ourselves. If we were denied it by someone else, maybe we never could get it. But because we can only deny it to ourselves, there is no reason other than our own human stubbornness or our failure to take our prides down to the ground, that we might have the humility that will draw God nigh unto us and thus create in us grace, which grace will give us the wisdom and the determination to draw more of his will. And this is the whole thing. It's drawing his will. You take, for example, someone who decides that they're a little overweight. So they decide they won't eat for a while. And this is fine until the hunger pangs begin to rule their consciousness, and they feel compelled once again to eat. But the proper determination in pushing themselves away from the table, even if they never went on a diet, if they never took a diet pill, if they never took a smidgen of exercise, they could actually achieve the same thing by pushing themselves away from the table, which is an act of will. You realize that. There isn't a thing that can't be achieved because the human will is a reflection of the divine will. Now, I couldn't care less who accepts the truth of what I say, because I'm not out to try to gather a bunch of students together for myself. I have no desire except to serve the masters. I make the teachings available. I am told, go out into the highways and byways and compel them to come in. Bring them the teachings. But what you do with the teachings is up to you. The teachings are simple. We can only emphasize the power of the examples of the masters, and we can emulate the masters. And when we do, our vibrations will change. I am sure of one thing, and that is there is hope for all who will admit and allow the power of hope to be the moving force on the chessboard of life that motivates them and their life. We can change our goals if they're wrong. If they're partly right, it's all right that we keep on with them. There are momentums in life that are so strong that it's very difficult for people to overcome. You take, for example, the statement that Jesus made. He was talking about eunuchs. And he said, there are some that are born eunuchs, and I'm sure you can understand that a nun or a celibate lady who had been celibate for generations would probably have less difficulty in being celibate still if she wished to be than someone who had for the past 10 embodiments had probably 10 children each embodiment. You can see this point standing right before you. So Jesus said, there be some that are born eunuchs, and there are some that are made eunuchs of men. Through various sterilization processes, it is possible to make men and women both, so they have no desire at all for the flesh. They're a literal capon. Some are born eunuchs, some are made eunuchs, and he says some have made themselves eunuchs for the kingdom of heaven's sake. But he went on and stressed, he said, he that is able to receive it, let him receive it. So you see, it's really very foolish for people to hasten the process for someone who is unable to do a certain thing from a spiritual standpoint. Take, for example, someone saying, I'm a vegetarian, I don't eat any meat. Someone else says, well, I eat meat, and I'm still spiritual. I have seen spiritual meat eaters and spiritual vegetarians. I must admit, although I am a vegetarian myself, I must admit that in some cases, certainly not in all, I have seen greater cruelty in some people who are vegetarians than in some who are meat eaters. But an interesting side point here is the fact that whereas some people might be cruel and be vegetarians, in past lives they might have been carnivores, you see, and have residual manifestations of human cruelty and unkindness in their life, which they need to transmute. And I'm quite sure that the use of vegetarian food will help them to transmute those elements. Therefore, I must approve of that also. Yet, God has received both those that eat meat and those that eat it not. Salvation is not in the kitchen, but it is in the temple of man's life. And so, let us all understand in the matter of vibrations that we must give all people their freedom to expand from whatever step on the cosmic ladder they are. We must never have the weight of our condemnation thrust upon the life of another. Give all people freedom, and you will also become the recipient of that freedom. Give them bondage, and you may well bind yourself. So let life then be without dissimulation. Let us not be carried away with the meanderings of our human ego. Let us instead recognize that the great monad is the Spirit, and that every master has bowed his knee and confessed to the glory of God that the Christ is the true Son of God. He's bowed his knee to the Christ. And if he hasn't, then you see he still has an act to perform before he can carry on. As far as I know, I have never known any ascended being or any highly evolved spiritual being that has not had to enter into the gates of humility and to recognize that of myself I can do nothing. But with God I can do all things. Won't you say that for yourself tonight as I close this lecture? Say it once. With God I can do all things. Ready now? With God I can do all things. Now, if you believe that, if you feel that, nothing shall be impossible unto you. Thank you.